Yeah, I'm so excited to have Chris CPat Patterson here. And I want to learn more about Risk Wrangler and Pat. This is so interesting.
Sure, absolutely. I've been in the GRC and information security space probably dating back to 2007, 2008. So I'm probably one of the veterans now at this point. Hat switched when I started. I moved into sales and I just finished a conference up in Calgary. Part of that process up there, they do what's called a white hat ceremony where you actually get sworn in and you do oath to have fun in Calgary and it ties into Stampede. But I didn't know at the time, it's kind of a big deal. Like I can get through the airport faster than most. But when I got into sales, as a joke, I wore it kind of to Dallas. And then at the time, our social media director said, "Oh, well, you also have to have a Twitter handle." I didn't want to do that. But they came by and they were checking our laptops to make sure we had it. So I said, "Well, I'm going to be the Risk Wrangler." And that was 2017 and it just kind of stuck. A great way for folks. They're looking for me at RSA or Black Hat. They're like, "Well, where's CPAT?" And they're like, "Well, he's right over there with the white hat." There are a couple other folks that are also doing kind of similar things. But I'd like to say I was one of the originals, maybe out there with Alan Alford and a couple other folks going way back when these days. There's a whole thing to the white hat for sure if you go up to Calgary.
Okay. I haven't been up there. I've been to Ottawa, but I haven't been to
Yeah, Stampede is something else.
one day. One day I'll make it. You've been in for a long time.
I think saying you've been in is probably the right way to put it.
I was looking at your LinkedIn bio. There's a lot of different things you're in. So the Cyber Resource Cadence Framework, what exactly is that? And how is it helpful to the cybersecurity community?
That really came into cyber cadences and planning, of making sure that if you're a leader, you're looking at your year, looking at different pieces fit into the calendar, right? So we always know budget season's coming. So you want to get for that by 4 or 5 months, start looking at what vendor relationships you have. Always know when your certain vendor relationships are expiring. Maybe it's time to upgrade a new platform or something. Most of those contracts require lead time to get that done. So that's one part of it. Insurance, your insurance renewals, another point in time of the year where it's good to get with your leadership teams, review your risk posture, view improvements you've made to your security architecture. All these things, lead time, need to be put into kind of your cyber risk cadence, your planning structures. Otherwise, very easy. We get so busy, cybersecurity, governance, risk, and compliance. We often forget to do that. Part of that annual planning process as well in that cadence is going back and reevaluating your risks, right? What happens year to year changes. Like if you go back to early in my history, in 2007, 2008, we didn't have the types of attacks we see now. We might have had Heartbleed or something, script kiddies causing problems or something like that. There were some denial of service attacks, but now you're talking about third parties or adversaries embedding things in third party software. I think we all assume that could have been an attack vector, but back then it was probably something probably didn't think about, and that's a big part of risk for everybody. So what's changed in your environment? What do you need to change in your security architectures? All of that ties into that cyber resource planning, that cyber resource calendar. Just make sure you have those dates locked in there and get that cadence set up.
Okay. No, that's great. Do you like on your website, do you have like a checklist or something like that around it or?
It's funny. I need to republish. I was just looking at the Risk Wrangler site, and it does need an update. So I will take you up on that. I do think I've got a LinkedIn article or two out there on the cyber risk cadence. So that's probably the best way to find some of that is if you visit my LinkedIn page, which is also under Risk Wrangler. You should be able to find some of the articles I've written around cyber risk cadences. The other one, what I do with the Enterprise Risk Quantification Institute, and that's the idea of doing risk quantification, understanding which method of quantification using, what method for the right risks as you don't want to do. I've seen a lot of organizations try to use super complex methods on absolutely every single risk. And if you're going to accept some of those risks this year, it's not worth doing all that extra math on. You may need to kind of do initial triage around it from a high level number perspective, but save the effort for the deeper things where you're going to get into investment. You need to go justify investment and things along that line. And then the right time, where are you in that risk management cycle? I'm one of the few people probably in the Enterprise Risk Quantification Institute that does say that ordinal scales and heat maps are okay. If you're like in the very early phases of just trying to survey an entire company and say, hey, tell me what your top 5 priorities are, that type of thing. That first triage thing has its place because maybe you surface something you hadn't seen before because people are very easily able to kind of go do some very quick stack rankings. Then you use that and go into your kind of your other phases of the risk management cycle. So just that original kind of assess or inventory phase, I don't have as much heartache using some of those more ordinal scale, less true risk quantification dollars, likelihood sense. One thing I look at too, making sure you're using the right method of risk quantification for the right risk at the right time is another big article and something I've spoken a lot on in the past.
How big does an organization need to be when you actually start? Because I usually work in the SMB space, so we don't really get just really simplified as
You should
far as quantifying.
It's like, but you should always sit down, at least not a long conversation to have with any business, right? I never really approach it from a cyber perspective, even when I'm in manufacturing now. You can't go to an operator and really start bringing up cyber because it's not the first thing on their mind. Typically start the conversation with, when was the last time our operation was down, or when did we really lose money? Tell me about what that looked like. If you're in my world, somebody will say, we lost the line, it was down for 3 days, and we lost X number of dollars, and it was because Bob forgot to do an update on a machine or something. It wasn't even a cyber attack, but you get them to start talking about what those risks are around here in Louisiana, hurricanes, and maybe your business doesn't get by a hurricane, but you're shut down while everybody's out of town, kind of fleeing the event, the loss there. Well, how do you deal with that? How do you shut down operations, reconstitute operations if you have to look at it from that perspective? Just as an exercise saying, what are the things that could cause us to potentially have some type of material loss? And what are those ranges? And that's what, if you're dealing in risk quantification, and this goes back to Doug Hubbard, really kind of the initial person brought this into the space with Richardson, a method called calibrated estimation. And calibrated estimation, what you do is just get that range, right? So you get the expert in the room. So maybe you have the CFO, maybe you have the CEO, and you say, hey, when you guys had that loss, the range, do you think that would hit from an annual or hourly perspective? Whatever you can get them to give you that number. It's between 10 million and 5 million, or it's between 1 and 6. So you've got more data by doing that than just getting somebody to say, hey, I rate that as a 1 or a 2. And then typically what I do to get the next piece of it is, you'll see a lot of risk quantification folks say, give me your percent likely. And people struggle with that. Go back to the CEO and say, hey, when was the last time, let's use the hurricane example as a resilience example. When was the last time a hurricane really impacted your operation? Oh, well, it was Ida. Well, when was that? That was 5 years ago. Well, when was it before that? Well, it was probably another 5 before we had an event like that. So what you're telling me is type of event could happen once every about 5 years. No, it's probably more like 1 in 7. Getting those executives to start talking about what could impact their business. And then just even with that very simple math, the ability to turn that into a loss exceedance or loss expectancy, can at least get an estimate. Now you're stack ranking dollars rather than 1 through 5 numbers that mean absolutely nothing to the business. I typically approach those conversations. They'll see that number and they'll say, well, Chris, you came up with a $3 million loss a year. Well, that's the same as you driving in your car, right? You don't have a wreck every day you go out and drive your car. Insurance agency is extracting that premium because they've done the same estimate. They've said over the lifetime of you driving that car, if I spread that out, the annual loss expectancy is maybe $1,000 a month. Who knows, right? But God forbid you get a car and you have an accident or something, a big deal. That could be a 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 year event. Maybe a 1 in never 1 in 50. You're starting to get that ranging and understanding, and then it helps that organization figure out, hey, this is where we need to put our money to address things, right? In our cyber world, it depends on every business. Phishing, very heavy, maybe because you're in the retail space. Is it more, I'm concerned about ransomware getting on my machines and locking up the manufacturing floor or something like that? So which of those attacks are kind of common in your industry, even if you're a SMB? What are the nightmare stories? And then looking at, hey, I probably need to make an investment in X to try to offset and make that harder on that adversary to get, is typically how I have those conversations. And pick top 3. Don't try to get to all of them, but get that conversation. It'll start to get you into that risk cadence of planning for those things annually.
Okay. No, that's great. I saw that you have been a speaker. I guess it's FairCon. So I went to one of Fair's.
Yeah, that's a long time ago.
And would you say that they're the leaders, quantification, risk?
There are a lot of different methods that are out there. If you get further down into oil and gas and operations, they're big, in the energy markets specifically, they're very big fans of the bow tie method. It's even more complex, but I learned a lot from David Vose while I was at Archer. He's since passed away, a big proponent of looking at bow ties. If you look at the FAIR methodology, it really is kind of a bow tie just tilted on its side. And that's where you kind of have layers of things that are failing, right? So if I have a failure this point, then what's the next failure? Very large enterprises, government, nuclear reactors, probably some major manufacturers that are doing heavy, large scale industry may lean more towards both sides. So you're getting it into the right method. I usually would tell folks, if you look at top of the FAIR model, it really is just loss magnitude and that likelihood, the two numbers we were just talking about. Give me a range of what you think the dollars are, and give me a range of, is this a 1 in 5, once a year, once in 6 months, this could happen once a month. And that is enough to start having those conversations. I dealt for a long time when I was back at FedEx in a former life in the strategy world. And in a lot of cases, if you have enough information to make that decision, and the execs have been in this business for a long time, that's enough for them to move forward. You don't necessarily need kind of that third and fourth level of the FAIR framework, unless, of course, you're dealing with a bigger problem. Maybe I'm looking to redo an entire infrastructure and I'm looking to spend tens of millions of dollars or something. Well, then you probably need to, this is no longer kind of a back of the envelope small budget problem. Maybe you do want to look at, am I getting enough of an offset here in kind of our investment to actually mitigate that risk? And that's where the second, third, and fourth level of the FAIR framework really come into play. Really where I've used it in the past is if it's budgetary, large budgetary items, that's when you break out those simulations. You've got something to stand on when you go back to leadership and say, hey, look, we've run simulations on this. You can show them kind of what your assumptions were, had them tweak them occasionally. If you're in with finance, they really want to get down in the math. But in general, they're just looking for that top level number. I would say, look at the sales folks, right? Sales and marketing comes into a meeting. They use simple linear regression, show what their sales forecast is, and pull down budget of tens of millions of dollars, just some fairly straightforward linear regression. I do think Monte Carlos and that complexity has its place, whereas don't try to do every single thing in your organization doing a full FAIR model, or it starts to become challenging. Again, unless, of course, your industry is one of those where you're going to have that level of scrutiny and you're doing massive amounts of spend on certain projects. It totally makes sense. But a lot of further down the chain outside of the Fortune 500 can get away with lighter methods and still have much better results than just doing ordinal scale 1 through 5 rankings. Again, joke I always say is following WannaCry, not Petya. We went into finance and we said, hey, I've got 3 reds, 2 yellows, and 4 greens, and give me $2 million. And they just kind of like, what? No way. You need to, that's when I got into looking for risk quant, is the data science team at the time. And they were like, isn't there a better method to do this? You've got to go find out something. And that's where I started coming across Jack Jones's work, Doug Hubbard and Rich, and kind of the Enterprise Risk Quantification Institute really grown just in the past decade or so. But none of this is new. Doug Hubbard will tell you that. Rich will tell you that. This stuff is, insurance and companies have been doing this for eons, and it's how they calculate your premiums, what to do relative to your insurance policies. And insurance is something else you have to look at. Do I want to spend this money on this very expensive IT implementation, or can I offset this with insurance? And then typically you'll see very quickly, even with your insurance limits in cyber, that also becomes very costly. It does become a true turn on countermeasure and control, is what we say ROI. I was taught not to do that by a very good finance person. They said, you haven't put a package on the belt with everything you're doing. You were not a return on investment. You're a return on something else. And he didn't know what it was. I said, return on countermeasure? That's a good thing. But you don't say return on investment to the other execs. You're going to get run out of the room.
Okay. I come from networking, cybersecurity, the risk. I usually work in the SMB. So we're just doing like the really,
but they're simple scenarios, right? I usually tell folks, if they're going to read Jack Jones' book on FAIR, the one that I remember setting it down after being through the first few chapters of like the whole ball tire example, all these things. They're great examples on, we've been doing this wrong. I still use his content when I do a lot of talks. I'll put the list of things up there, cloud. I'll put things up there like North Korean, a nation state. I'll put in not Petya, it's a particular type of ransomware. And I'll say, which ones of these are risks? And somebody will say, oh, well, they're all risk. Cloud's a risk, and not Petya's a risk, and North Korean's a risk. What Jack and Doug also do, Rich, and all these things, they're like, no, you've got to get this to a scenario. There's got to be something, an asset that gets broken, right? So if I'm running my payroll in a cloud system and payroll gets compromised and my workers stop coming to work because I can't pay them for 4 weeks, I have something that costs dollars and I need to defend that payroll system to a certain level. You can actually start doing that math, right? Even if it's a simple kind of initial estimates and ranging. An example I've been researching here recently, because this is a big deal in Europe, right? So recent discussion I had with CISO was our risk is actually bigger from a regulation, from this NIS2 cyber regulation in Europe is 2% of global revenue, just like GDPR is. I said, look, if we lost production at a plant for a month, it's going to be 2% of our global revenue. I'm not sure it is, right? So suddenly when you start stack ranking the annual loss expectancy of these things, get people to open their eyes and they're like, you're right, we probably need to put some more effort into that regulation, being sure we're in good shape. A very, very prescriptive regulation, actually. But that became the bigger risk to look at least on this period, back to almost full circle to annual cycles. Like for this cycle, we're going to put some more effort in this space because bigger, or if not big as any type of breach you would have, right? And you can model that as well. Like what's our posture? What are the odds of a regulator coming in here and giving us a fine, right? And you can hide that, Chris. Like, well, how often does the FDA come in here? How often does the SEC come into an organization? Caused that before? Could that happen to us? So you can model all these things. It takes a little bit of thought. And then the best thing about all this is when you start sticking those flags in the ground and having those discussions, then that's when executives will get engaged. Even our CTO and I, he's been like, that number's crazy. I was like, well, here, help me put a better number on there. I don't know. You're getting them engaged in that discussion. You're actually changing the way leaders think about the resiliency of their business. And that's really what you're trying to help them do. This is also why I typically do partner very closely with the insurance folks. Here's another trick, right? So people say, well, how do you find out what somebody's risk appetite is? I've learned this also kind of from Rich when I was in the insurance industry. You ask, what's your limit on your insurance policy, your cyber insurance policy? Well, $10 million. I said, that's your risk appetite. I'm willing to lose $10 million before I have to dip into my treasury and start spending money against whatever problem I have. We could afford a little bit. Okay, well, how much of the treasury can go away before it becomes an issue? Half? All of it? You're willing to go right up to the edge of bankruptcy? Again, you're into a discussion of what is your risk appetite? Even though you're kind of pegging it to insurance, to start the discussion by saying, what's our limit? How much, if we have a breach over this, what's it going to cost us? Now you're getting into the appetite of those leaders, what they're willing to do to fund the program. You're still talking about, we have to have these things. The framework's always good for giving you, I always say, kind of a good playbook. Hey, start looking here, but then always take it back to longer term is, what does that threat look like? Is it actually pertinent to my industry? If that attack gets through, back to those scenarios, like you're saying, from the security perspective, if that attack was successful and they had full access to the network, really, what's really the impact for us?
There was a retail store, I can't remember, it was in the UK, but they ended up losing like 90% of their revenue. It was like 340 million down to like 34.
That's annual revenue. If you're dipping in, if you have treasury and reserves that you're holding for rainy days and you're starting to eat into that can be quite painful. Funny, you'll see people always say reputation's a big deal, but there's research around this. You look at Target and Home Depot back in the day, and those were fairly significant breaches, and their stocks rebounded pretty good. Their operations were back up and running. Their balance sheet took it. But sometimes reputation isn't as big a deal. I guess what type of business you're in. If there's loss of life, I think that typically kind of people remember that and think about that a little bit more. But it really is the impact and the ability for the business to withstand some type of significant hit. Up to what level then does it start to impact? If I can't pay bonuses this year because I ate up the whole treasury, or am I going to lose my best talent that's running the organization? Is that something that's a risk? There are companies that have gone fully bankrupt. They didn't estimate the ability and really recovery. I really do focus on that in the cybersecurity program. You can have all the fancy stuff in the world, but if somebody wants to get you, or somebody makes a stupid mistake, an employee does something and accidentally lets something quite bad in, and you don't have all the countermeasures to defend against it, your only defense at that point is to recover, right? So are your backups being done properly, tested, archived in a way that they can't be also encrypted? That's happened. Do you understand? Do you have a forensics team that can help you? And I've seen this happen. It happens more frequently. People think, hey, let's go ahead and restore from backup. Well, they find out that particular exploit's been in that backup for 6 months now. They just end up reinfecting themselves. So they end up losing 6 months of data, right? Versus knowing how to forensically go remove those things before you extract them. Because again, it's valuable time. The company's often losing money. So having the right forensics partner, forensics retainer is also kind of one of those things I always put at the top of the list, because at some point, someday, something bad is going to happen. And as you're saying, in most small businesses, having somebody, an ally there that can quickly come in, they've at least looked at your environment, they know what they're dealing with, they've got some notes on it. That's almost another form of insurance that I think most organizations should consider.
I saw a CISO representative, and he said every single ransomware attack where they came in, the backups had been encrypted.
Yep. Gotta keep them cold. Like I used to at one of my old companies, I literally had them take a couple terabyte drives, and we had a safe. And it wasn't a big operation, wasn't expensive. Take those things. I want all the source code. like at least once every 6 months, take it all and
Yeah.
put it there, lock it up. It's encrypted drive that God forbid we had to start from complete zero. At least we would have that, not be digging around for this stuff. So backing up those repositories, cloud backups have gotten much better at segmenting that stuff. There are even better things. There are more advanced tools that can actually see, hey, there's a change in this backup from this one to that one that looks strange enough that you might actually have picked up an infection, or this is where you picked it up, where the point in time where it happened. The big part of it, you brought up CISA. CISA offers a bunch of great free tools for businesses to do, and you probably are aware of some of that, and worth mentioning, doing testing and review of your infrastructure, especially for SMBs, to help them improve their posture.
So I saw you had this about the exec, and there's a couple of things. One of the things I want to ask you about is with the SEC and went after the CISO, and I'm trying to remember this. The solar winds.
Oh yeah.
And one of the things that they said is that on the risk register that they had all these generic risks that they didn't have like really custom, like the actual risks that
those first few chapters of Jack Jones' book, right? It talks about how to build a good scenario, right? So there's got to be some asset that's at risk, right? There's got to be some form of attack. Something is attacking that asset. And there's some type of set of defenses you may have in place or not have in place. What's the likelihood of that actually occurring? Really, the very basics. Not naming some asset. We just kind of went through one. It's like the payroll database. If you're not working through what those things are and what those attackers are, what attack vectors they're using, how they're working their way through the MITRE framework potentially, what you have to do, the scenarios you want to have in your risk register, because putting cloud in your risk register is not a risk. Kind of covered that already. It really is some of the executive makeover along doing just, hey, okay, if this happened, that's the same as a plant outage. And you're back to, what was our last plant outage? I bring some pen testers in here and I could probably cause a plant outage and be down for 3 days. Last time we were down for 3 days, what did that create? Again, so why you want those operators in the room feel that pain and understand what that looks like from an operation. We don't want that to happen. The ability to bring it back to those resilience discussions, maintain maintenance of your operation is always the way to have those.
Let's say, where your source, and you realize, hey, we found out servers end up to put it on a new device or put it in the cloud. Should you actually have that to me, you need to have that in your risk register.
So you could say asset at risk at that point is our source code and thing the company runs on. And the scenario is, so this is where who's going to attack you, right? If you're a major company, the odds of a nation state coming after you or your critical infrastructure are much higher than just a restaurant here in New Orleans or something. But so even if it was just a business opportunity, a ransomware group or something like that, they want to ransom your source code. And they're going to charge you, go research all this. You have AI to do it. You can go look at the claims information, what insurance companies have paid out in claims in this space. And what if they ransom us for $2 million and they have our source codes? What are we going to do? Well, if I've got it back up in a separate repository, disconnected, we've been checking it. We do restores to make sure it's functioning, safe, then you've mitigated that risk, right? And that risk is not what it was. And you can potentially recover it. And quite frankly, in some of those cases, you may be not able to say we didn't take a loss. The problem with that is that they got in and got that far to where they actually were able to ransomware. You got other problems. Your countermeasures and your controls failed at some point. You're going to have to build those back up. You can't just reconstitute the operation. So there's always that additional cost, right? Somebody from forensics is going to say, yep, got in, you had a misconfigured firewall, or somebody accidentally clicked on a fish. You should have had better email screening, kind of that type of capability. Again, looking at those countermeasures, because at the end of the day, even if it is kind of a ransomware opportunist that's out there, if they come knocking on CPat's door and he's pretty buttoned up, and like any other common criminal, you walk around the neighborhood and somebody's got cameras and a fence and the dog's barking, what? I think I'm going to skip that one. Go down to Debra's house, Debra's guy didn't have cameras and the dog's on a leash back there. He can only patrol a certain area. Maybe this is a better place. They will constantly scanning us. They're looking for those windows of opportunity. Sadly, a lot of organizations have probably been scanned. They know that you're a potential target and waiting. Maybe they're going after a bigger fish that's out there. You have to think through these countermeasures. You have to basics in security hygiene. Or people say these compliance checklists don't mean that you're going to be secure. Taking what they're telling you to heart to some of the controls you can implement. Okay, if I do this control that's in this framework, what type of attack is that going to prevent? And am I susceptible to it? At least it'll help you prioritize, do I need to go after first, right? Protect identities. Let's protect the perimeter. Again, it's going to vary business to business. Each building your risk plan, your risk management plan is an exercise in risk management itself, right? Where do we start doing this planning? What are the toolings and what are the controls we need to put in place first? And then just start building it out year to year. And have insurance for everything you don't, because at some point, you're likely going to become a target.
Back to the solar winds, another thing that the SEC said is they knew from emails that and presentations, they knew the CISO understood the seriousness of the issue. And they hadn't had a pen test report, and they basically, the pen tester was saying anybody can get access to this and do whatever they want, essentially, which is what happened. And they complained. One of the things the SEC said, telling briefing executive management the true level of risk. And I was sitting there thinking, everybody wants to have their bonus. I know there's a political and what they're telling the higher ups. That a lot of times it could just be that it was trying to hide this nefariously or whatever, but that wanted to look good.
I tell people that all the time. A lot of folks talk to a lot of students, especially down here in Louisiana, in this area. And I'm probably too brutally honest, but getting into cybersecurity, it's long hours. I tell people it's kind of like being a law enforcement officer, right? There's a lot of sitting around and kind of doing basics and doing that. And then there's some really crazy incidents. And then you still end up doing a bunch of paperwork after it, right? And you're working all kinds of hours while you're sorting that out. Everybody seems to think it's a lot of cops and robbers, but it's a lot of configurations, checking locks. I think about the security guards, right? They're walking around checking doors to make sure they're locked and making sure the cameras are on. It really is a lot of that. But then these are the analogies you have to bring back to the executives. Like, well, if we're not going to do a good cybersecurity program, well, let's take the fire suppression system out of the plant. Let's just leave the doors open tonight. Why not? It's the same thing. Right? You have to get back to them in business terms to help them understand some of these risks are direct impact to the resilience of the operation, where those conversations start. We've talked about it quite a few times, but that is the challenge. And you're going to have to be the bad guy. I can't tell you the number of times literally it was been denying people, oh, I want an exception to put blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, the documentation from where the vendor says that their software will not run on my machine, Windows with this configuration of a virus, Defender or whatever. Well, guess what happens is these people are some of them were lazy. They didn't want to put it in. Other times there are legitimate reasons and the vendor comes, okay, well, you're going to have to put another control to try to protect that environment. And depending on how big that environment is, there's a risk. And then you always turn around. You are just the consultant explaining the risks to the executives. Ultimately, your risk management program, they should be the ones signing off, just like any other risk. You're doing your job right as a cybersecurity or risk executive, saying it's the same thing as like internal audit. They're the ones that say, hey, you have these problems, you guys can fix them or not, but this is how you're going to deal with it, right? And this is what the impact is and how we're going to write the report up. How you start to get to that. At least a couple of times in my past where I pushed an analysis across and said, here's what potentially could happen. You're going to sign on this, or I'm just going to notate that I gave it to you and you didn't want to sign on it. I'm going to still put that in the record. You're going to have to accept this risk. And then somebody said, they call them the T-Rex arms. Well, I don't know. Let's talk about this a little bit more. You have to, all the way back to kind of the opening of our conversation, that changes when you're talking about dollars and you're not talking about it's a 1. It's a 1, it's our top priority. Or it's a 5, it's our, that's the other thing. People flip these scales when it becomes a discussion and they understand. Those are tough conversations to have. If somebody likes to have those tough conversations, potentially going to end up in trouble or with a bad reputation, because when the investigators come, they're going to come looking around. CISO friends that they were asking them to sign certain pieces of paper that said this company is doing X, Y, and Z. And I was like, you got to get out of there. Like, get your job, get your resume ready, get out of it. Stall, whatever you can do. But if they're trying to make you sign that, then other stuff going on at that particular company, and you need to get as far and fast away from there. Their company gets breached. They're asking you to falsify things and put your signature on things that they're not doing. The trap. Unfortunate that CISOs and security leaders are put in those positions, but one of those things, if you don't like that kind of pressure and that type of thing, and hey, what does it take to be a CISO? Well, if he or she isn't kind of face up to some of that stuff. We've had other friends that they did get completely wrongly accused of things and had to hire their own PR people because they literally tried to destroy their careers. They didn't sign the things that they were talking about. So it seems a lot of fun fighting cyber criminals, and people see the Matrix and hackers and movies and this looks like this is going to be great. It's not all that. legal. I'm the closest I can ever be to being an attorney without going to law school. I've read so many contracts, had to look for things that were not good ideas from a cybersecurity.
Right. Get asked those questions too. Have that in my, I have a little thing like in my statement of work contract. I'm not an attorney, but you get,
Yeah, I know you have to. You have to.
get pulled into that.
There are good boutique firms that you can go help companies like that say, look, I'll help draft this and we'll get to a certain state, but by no means and should this go for anybody until it's been reviewed by an actual attorney. A cyber attorney, even at that point, $200 or $300 for at least a once over, as far down the road as you can. But it's always good to have them look over cyber.
I wanted to ask you about this next. So what is that?
I'm really seeing a couple articles out just in the past couple of days, working AI into the actual GRC processes at the right place. That's part of it. GRC is purpose built for large language models, right? So all these great AI tools are all about used to do natural language processing when we're doing data science before this became a big thing, but they're really good to tune the models to doing some of the things we're talking about, building better scenarios, revising scenarios and things along that line, building very quickly, building very flat. All of my GRC tables are not, if you go back and looked at the way we used to build these things, they were highly linked out to, and that's what my background's about, graph database stuff. They were very highly networked diagrams. So you had risk registers here and you had evidence all over the place. The architectures I'm putting in place now are very, very flat tables, right? The types of things that Tableau, Spotfire, Power BI love flat tables, right? Because they can just crank through it. Well, guess what else likes flat tables? AI models, right? If you can help that AI model understand what those rows are about, what those columns are about, how they relate to each other, and you don't even have to write a schema, right? Just explain it. Capability, especially the models in the past 2 or 3 months, has been quite interesting and mind-blowing. So, but you have to get your data. If I'm still having to unify from 20 repositories, that's hard. But if I've got it mapped and described properly, in these large flat tables, or even better, a graph database, AI can get its head, seems weird, but you can get its model wrapped around it. That's huge. And working on with at least a couple of companies on, well, how do we also protect that content, right? So that's going to be the next thing. What are the models around doing that? That's the other piece of architecture I'm ready to discuss in public yet. Potentially it's coming out soon. Types of things we used to have to do with big data. Think about big retailers, logistics companies that could be sitting on 20 and 30 million customers in some cases. They still need to do market research. When we were doing big data back in the 2010 to 2017, tokenize, how'd you make that data so it was usable by the engines that were doing the statistics and the analysis? But if a human ever got a hold of it, or a system ever got a hold of it, nonsensical, right? Having those structures you're feeding into this for that to work, you're giving information about the risk posture of your organization in the wrong hands. That could be a problem. The core of it is really looking at not using the traditional GRC architectures that are out there and flattening and making things as common as possible. Don't have 10 risk registers, don't have 5 evidence libraries, don't have 4 policy libraries. Get that stuff as concentrated, because then you can start to do much better things with it because it has access to kind of the broader data set from
Okay, great.
some of my data scientist background may have snuck out there.
That's cool. So I saw post quantum on there. What do you say? What do you think about the Q day?
We were talking Q day. Geez, that was back in 2017. We were up in Chicago with one of the big electronics manufacturers, and we were talking with some of the folks in the government. It was like they were going through, hey, we think when we hit, probably rusty on the math now because I haven't looked at it a little bit, but when we hit so many qubits, we'll be able to break all RSA encryption. This is kind of the first time I really got into it. I was like, well, that's a Y2K. Those of us who were around then knew what the day was. The problem with Q day is it could be tomorrow. It could be probably not tomorrow. It could be the end of this year. It could be 10 years out. So you're dealing with a moving target. I think the people that were looking at this from a security perspective are like, well, we're going to have the standard out, and then we're going to have this. And so at the time I was working for one of the software security vendors, I was like, guys, that's great, but then we've got to fold that into our architecture, and then that's got to get folded into database architecture. We sell the customers. I've got to go sell the big companies like, hey, you guys need to swap out all this stuff, upgrade, potentially at some expense, quantum safe encryption and things along that line, because even then a bit scary, because the adversaries have been storing all of the lots and lots of web content pages Oh, you crack that. Now I'm starting to see password patterns, user logins, feed that into AI, and how quickly can I start to mount attack. The reality of quantum computing creating that issue and where you're dependent, again, what industry and how much of a target you are, a little bit frightening. I stepped away from some of that because I'm not in the security vendor space anymore, especially at the time. There's an interesting and odd threat out there around that. We're even seeing it. I'm not even sure if we have to get to quantum for that. There was just an article this week where they had cut loose one of the AIs on open source libraries, and they found all kinds of new exploits that even some of the best experts had. We live in a very, very interesting timeline and time frame. We had that discussion back to ability to recover them becomes the only thing. Because if I get exploited by some crazy less than 0 day because an AI found it that we haven't even logged it anywhere, found it so fast that it's already exploited. Those are big challenges, I think, for our industry. Propose I've got all the answers except for back to how do you recover, understand the resilience if that scenario happened to you, if we lost everything because it was a 0 day type attack, still classified as a 0 day type attack based on AI. Quickly, the answer is still the same. The countermeasure is still the same. It's reconstitute operations. How do we go either brownfield or greenfield, bring everything back up? There are case studies around this, right? If you look at, we had the Iran attacks, all this going on this weekend. That Saudi Aramco attack that happened many years ago wiped out almost everything. I know they had to go get new memory sticks, and that's why back then there was like some shortage. Remember the memory prices spiked up there for a while because Saudi Aramco, I think, bought all the memory from Singapore or wherever and said, we need all of that. We need to redo everything to make sure this is clean, because remember the actual details, or nor do I think they ever really revealed all of it. But that's an example of something they had to make a massive investment and go in and literally greenfield everything back up. Those are the types of things that the resilience discussions, like, and cybersecurity always seems fun, fighting the bad guys, building all the kind of cool, fun things that are on the defense side, but the recovery and the resiliency piece of it, probably, if you're going to spend that, there's the first, we always play this games like, if you only could pick 3 things for your organization in security, what would you pick? And one thing I always say is a really good recovery program, or how to be resilient, reconstitute operations.
So thing on the post-quantum, good thing, like in OpenSSL now, they actually have some of the post-quantum resistant algorithms in. So that's good.
Yeah. The more, but
so we are getting prepared.
Good. So now at least starting to encrypt all the inline traffic and things along that line. Like, but now you got to like think about all the reams of data we have out there that are just sitting in databases, not post-quantum enabled. And same thing, similar to probably our other evolutions, we'll have these hard outer shells and soft GUI middles until now you're back into prioritization. So does upgrading this particular set of hardware to the latest capabilities? That's a good question. Hey, this is probably for the RPs, is whatever data sets or whatever I'm using post-quantum ready as well. Maybe that's a vendor trade-off. One vendor can do it, then maybe there's a slight premium for it. One vendor can't. Back to the risk is, what's the asset? How can we operate if this thing, if we lose it? Well, maybe we should pay that 5-10% premium a vendor has post-quantum enabled their architectures.
That's one thing about the Q day. I was like, okay, I went out and I was looking at the OpenSSL, and I'm like, okay, better now that it's actually. Now I do know a lot of times developers.
I don't want to throw NIST under the bus, but apparently they announced the first standard, and I think some kids like in college or something, maybe even in high school, cracked it with a regular computer. I was like, oh, that's not good. I went back to the drop, a little bit of a black eye. But it's good. At least they're doing something right. For us to sit around and think this may not come. I can't think of anything governments be building quantum computers to do. That's probably the first use case that they're after, is cracking encryption, right?
The other thing is symmetric cryptography. The thing is,
yeah,
I always like to point that. But anyway, I was so great having you today and being able to talk to you about risk. Let's definitely stay in touch. At some point, I'll go down to New Orleans. I'm originally from Houston.
Okay, that's not that far.
I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Absolutely. Hosting, I do a plug for B-Sides. May 12th is B-Sides New Orleans. We just finished our call for papers. That's closing up right now. And we should have a great lineup posted on the website here soon. We are still taking sponsors. It is a super inexpensive ticket, $55, I think. But right now we're gonna have a slowly escalating version of that. But 4 full tracks here in New Orleans. We get a lot of folks in from the town as speakers. Great. If you make one event this year and you can't afford the bigger ones, try to make it great for everybody.
Okay, great.
NOLABsides.com.
Okay, I'm gonna check it out. So
yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks, Debra. Great talking to you. Cheers.
Okay. Bye.
Talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to pick up a copy of my book, A CISO Guide to Cyber Resilience, available on Amazon. And remember to stay cyber resilient.